justice, and the American way. We are the Voices of Dissent.
Hello.
Hey, thank you, sir, for making it.
Sure.
You're on the Voices of Dissent. Professor Dershowitz is a Brooklyn native who is one of the most popular criminal defense attorneys in the country. Thanks for joining us, sir.
Hey, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
Absolutely. Hey, we were actually just talking, segueing into you, we were talking about the Mike Tyson case where you represented Mr. Tyson back in 1992 here in Indiana.
That was the most corrupt case in the most corrupt judicial system I have ever experienced. Let me tell you, I have been in China. I've litigated cases in the Ukraine and in Russia. I have never experienced a legal system like the corrupt Indiana legal system. The Chief Justice, Shepard, took himself out of the case after he apparently sent his wife to talk to me off the record at a Yale reunion. The Judge Gifford in the case lobbied the appellate courts. The case was affirmed 2-2. It was the most outrageous, disgraceful display of injustice that I have experienced in 50 years of practice. Anybody who's part of the Indiana judicial system should be ashamed of themselves, should hang their heads in shame, and there should be an investigation of Judge Shepard, Judge Gifford. You know, after she did this, she got promoted. You know, also, the prosecutors in the case picked the judge in violation of all law and practice. They picked a former rape prosecutor to try the case. It is so outrageous. I'm still fuming about it. I wrote about it in my autobiography called Taking the Stand, and I suggest that every Indiana citizen read that chapter in my book, Taking the Stand, and understand you are not part of a legitimate legal system. You're part of a corrupt legal system.
Mr. Dershowitz, my name's Marc Jernigan. It's a pleasure to meet you. It's fantastic to interview. We were just echoing those sentiments before your call. From my perspective, when I look back at that trial, there were two trials at the same time. There was essentially the same trial. It was your trial with the Tyson case, and then the Kennedy case as well. And the coverage and the way the Mike Tyson case was handled was entirely different than how the Kennedy case was handled, and it was black and white difference.
Well, and also the Indiana media didn't analyze the role of the judiciary. Judge Gifford should have been removed from the bench for what she did in the case, holding a press conference saying that if this conviction were reversed, it would cost the citizens a lot of money, calling other appellate judges. This is what we were told by a number of insiders, that she was calling appellate judges and saying, oh, it's going to hurt my career, I'll never get promoted if you reverse this conviction. And in the end, the case was decided 2-2, with the deciding vote that could have been cast by Judge Shepard, but his wife came over to me at a Yale reunion and said to me, and I have an affidavit of this in front of the president of the George Washington University, and said to me, excuse me, Mr. Dershowitz, but, you know, your New York style doesn't work in Indiana. And I said, excuse me, ma'am, who are you? She said, well, my name is so-and-so. I'm the wife of the Chief Justice. And I said, I'm sorry, I can't talk to you, and I walked away. And as the result of that, Judge Shepard removed himself from the case because he was afraid that his own sexual misconduct, which had been a subject of newspaper reporting, would come up again if he rendered the definitive and dispositive decision in the case in favor of Mike Tyson, which his previous votes in cases would have had to let him to do. So he got himself out of the case by this ploy, and first he denied it. He said, I'm not going to tell you why I got out of the case. I'm not going to tell you. I finally brought all kinds of legal proceedings, and he had to admit it was that episode at the Yale Law School where his wife came over to me and just told me that New York style doesn't work in Indiana, as if that's a recusal. But the judges who got phone calls from Judge Gifford, they didn't recuse themselves. They decided to participate in the case. I have to tell you again, China, Russia, South Africa, I've never seen a more corrupt system than Indianapolis, Indiana, back in those days. I don't know what's happened since. I know Judge Gifford was, I think, promoted, and Shepard stayed on as Chief Justice. I don't know where they are now, but in 50 years of practice, I've never experienced such corruption as I did in the Indiana legal system. And I challenge any of those judges to sue me for defamation because I am calling them corrupt. And if they want to have a remedy, hey, I'll come to Indiana. Well, maybe not Indiana. I'll go to any other state and defend myself. But I'll defend myself in the court of public opinion in Indiana. And I challenge either of them, if they're no longer on the bench, to debate me on this subject.
It's amazing.
Well, sir, we actually have a couple of. I'm a law student, and so is Jon Olinger over here as well. And we also have Nancy Marcus, who's a professor of law at Indiana Tech Law School here. Can you give us some advice on how do we fix the problem here in Indiana if it's so corrupt? What can we do?
Well, I think the media has to do it. I think you should start a website, a blog, and get lawyers anonymously to tell you what's going on. Lawyers are terrified. They don't want to get involved. They don't want to challenge because they know they'll be punished by the judicial system. So I think you should create an anonymous blog in which people can tell you stories with documentation of what happened in front of particular judges. And then there has to be, the public has to stand up in outrage. I mean, you could like Tyson, you could hate Tyson. That's not the issue. If it can happen to Mike Tyson, it can happen to any of you.
Oh, absolutely.
In Indiana.
Yeah.
And he had you.
Well, he had me.
Yeah, we can't afford you.
And Connolly, a very, very good law firm. He'd never had a shot because the case was essentially fixed from the very beginning.
No, he had never had a shot.
And one of the problems I have is the fact that any rape case, when it comes down to it, he said, she said, I think, that's one of the inherent problems with rape. It is he said, she said, and we're talking about putting somebody away for a long time.
But let me tell you why it wasn't he said, she said. There were 4 other witnesses. They were women who didn't know. I forget, maybe it was 3, maybe it was 4. It's a long time ago. 3 or 4 witnesses. They didn't know Mike Tyson. They didn't know Desiree Washington. They happened to be in front of the hotel, watching them go into the hotel at 2:30 or 3 in the morning, holding hands, necking, and kissing back and forth, which would have proved that Desiree Washington was lying in her testimony. She said she wasn't repelling him, that she was repelling him, she didn't want to do anything. Those 4 witnesses were excluded. They weren't allowed to testify by Judge Gifford, even though the Judge Gifford and the other side were notified as soon as possible. After the witnesses came forward, Gifford excluded them, and that was one of the bases of the appeal. And Indiana law was clear that you can't exclude witnesses. My God, especially in a he said, she said case, here you have 4 objective witnesses who were excluded, who never testified. And when jurors found out about that afterward, they were outraged. My God, if we had heard 4 objective witnesses say that they went into the hotel room holding hands, kissing, and snuggling, that doesn't mean he didn't rape her, but it means that she lied about the circumstances leading up to it.
Right. It speaks to the credibility of the witness.
It's a credibility issue, and also it goes to the issue of whether she consented or not. It's relevant when you have he said, she said, and for the judge to exclude those 4 witnesses was such an outrage. This was the easiest case I should have won. It was open and shut. Any first-year law student should have been able to win that case and would have won this case in front of any judicial system that was not corrupt.
Mr. Dershowitz, you've had a long, prestigious career. What case stands out as the one that you think is your most favorite shining case?
Well, it's the Anatoly Sharansky case. He was a dissident in the Soviet Union who was put in jail, and he was going to spend the rest of his life in jail, and I had to come up against the corrupt legal system of the Soviet Union. And less corrupt than Indiana, but corrupt nonetheless. And we eventually won that case. We got President Jimmy Carter to issue a statement saying that Sharansky was not an American spy. We used a lot of economic leverage, diplomatic leverage, and ultimately we got Sharansky out. He came to Israel in time to have a baby with his wife, who was approaching 40 at the time. And I think that case is so important to me because there, but for the grace of God, go I. I mean, his family and my family grew up in the same part of Europe, and my family took a left turn and went to America. His family took a right turn and went to the Soviet Union. I could have been the dissident. He could have been the lawyer. So that was really, really an important case for me. The famous cases are not that important to me. The Von Bülow case, the O.J. Simpson case, those are, criminal cases, but cases that have a real emotional meaning for me are cases with where I can really identify with the client. And, most recently I've been involved very much in defending Israel in the court of public opinion against unjust attacks. I just wrote a new ebook, which is available on Kindle for $5, and it's called Terror Tunnels, the case for Israel's just war against Hamas. And, I wrote that case in real time during the war and just published it immediately upon the end of the war. And so it's a real-time book dealing with real current events, with ISIS, with the American war on ISIS.
I read most of it last night.
I was really happy to do that.
Mr. Dershowitz, Ric Runsteadt here. First off, I want to thank you for the great work you've done in working against the divest movement that's spreading rapidly across Europe and even in the United States.
Yeah, no, I have a chapter in my Terror Tunnels, 10 good reasons why divesting from Israel will hurt the peace process rather than help it. So.
Right, and I know many people who are on both sides of the issue, and so I've got some, if you're okay, because you are the preeminent defender, in my opinion, of Israel, got some questions, kind of tough questions, but as you say, you only want the tough ones about this. So want to bring up something that's really right in your bandwidth, and that is that recently a Arab man, a Palestinian man in Israel, was sentenced to 18 months in jail because he had relations with a Jewish Israeli woman. She says that he had said he was Jewish, and later on it was found out he was not. And he, for not being Jewish and having had this relationship with her, he was sentenced by a judge to 18 months in jail.
Well, that's wrong. I wouldn't justify that. I think the reason was they claim that he defrauded her, that for her it was important to know what his ethnic background was. You know, we have cases like that in the United States as well. If, for example, a man says to a woman, I've had a vasectomy, and the woman has sex with him and he hasn't had a vasectomy, he could go to jail for that. Or if a man says, I have no STDs, and he did, he could go to jail for that. I don't believe that somebody should go to jail for deceiving somebody about religion. But so, look, I'm critical of Israel, and Israel deserves criticism, just like I'm critical of America, which I love, if America deserves criticism. So, throw them at me. I'll be happy to criticize Israel where it deserves to be criticized.
Well, and another issue that has come up is recently, 6-5, the Israeli Supreme Court has upheld the practice of not allowing Palestinians who are not citizens of Israel, who have married Palestinian citizens of Israel, to join their spouse. How do you feel about that?
Again, that's a security issue. They allow many to do it, but there was a movement among some Palestinian terrorists to have fake marriages with Israeli Arabs to come into Israel and to plan terrorist attacks. That's a legitimate concern. If it's based on any kind of religious issue, I don't believe in it. In fact, I don't call Israel a Jewish state. I call it the nation-state of the Jewish people. I don't want to see it as a religious state. I don't want to see another theocracy in the Middle East. And Israel is supposed to believe in separation of church and state, and it should. Of course, the Palestinian Authority is a Sharia state. It says it will be dominated by the Quran, and it has a law in its book saying no Jew will ever be allowed to buy land in Israel. So, you can criticize both countries, and I would criticize that Israeli decision as well.
Right, and Mr. Dershowitz, that's why we want to get your answers, because again, you like I said, you're the, in my opinion, the premier person in supporting and explaining Israel. And by the way, only 33 of the 3,000 applicants were not allowed. And so when you say it's security, I can see that. One question I also have is interfaith marriages. They are not allowed in Israel. Now, you can get married in another country and live together as an interfaith couple in Israel, but the actual practice of allowing a Christian to marry a Muslim or a Muslim to marry a Jew, it isn't allowed in Israel.
And it's a scandal, and I've been strongly opposed to it. I'll tell you what's even worse. A Jew can't marry a Jew in Israel if the male is from the priestly class, a Kohen, and the woman has been divorced. I mean, what happened is when Israel was first established, Ben-Gurion made a compromise with the chief rabbi and said, look, this is a secular state, but we'll let you handle the marriage aspects, and turned the marriage issues over to the religious authority. And so Christians have complete authority over Christians, Muslims have complete authority over Muslims, and the rabbis have complete authority over Jews. The Jews of Israel hate it. I would say if you had a vote, 75% of Israelis would be opposed to that. But the way the Israeli Knesset works, if they ever try to change that law, the dominant coalition would lose the religious members and the government would fail. When Ehud Barak was elected, he swore that he would eliminate this merger of church and state in the area of marriage and was not able to do so. So, again, it's a legitimate criticism of Israel. What happens is people just pop over to Cyprus, get married, and come back and live, as they choose to, because Israel recognizes marriage is conducted outside of Israel. But a very close friend of mine who was the Chief Justice of Israel, Chaim Cohen, who was a priest, married a divorced woman. He couldn't do it in Israel. The Chief Justice of Israel couldn't marry a Jewish woman in Israel, had to go to New York, get married, come back. and lived happily with his wife as a married couple forever. So these are awful things that should be changed, but they pale in comparison with terrorism, with rockets, with terror tunnels. So, Israel's the only country in the world where some people criticize an aspect of it and say, therefore, it has no right to exist. Criticize it, change it. Criticize it vocally, but don't say that Israel doesn't have the right to exist or it should be boycotted or divested against just because you disagree with some Israeli policies, because many Israelis disagree with Israeli policies, just like many Americans disagree with some American policies.
Right, and Mr. Dershowitz, another thing that had occurred in 2012 is on May 20th, Netanyahu gave a speech referring to African migrants in Israel as infiltrators and saying that they must be deported because they constitute, quote, an existential threat to a Jewish and democratic state.
Well, it's just like in the United States. They're illegal immigrants. They come over the border. They're illegal immigrants. They come in large numbers. I think that Israel could be a lot more welcoming and open, but a country is entitled to control its borders. I don't like any phrase that suggests that the presence of non-Jews in Israel would challenge the nature of the Jewish state. That's wrong. I think that it's enough to say that there are immigration procedures like every country has, and they ought to be followed. Some of my relatives came to this country, I'm sure illegally. They came right at the beginning or just near the beginning of the Second World War, and family members did everything in their power to bring them over to save them from the Holocaust, and I'm sure they turned some pretty sharp corners in doing it, and some of them have been very, very distinguished Americans. So, I'm very sympathetic even to illegal immigrants, and Israel ought to be more open to at least understanding why people would come. The other point, of course, is that what country do the people from Africa want to go to? They don't want to go to Egypt. They don't want to go to Jordan. They want to go to Israel. It must be because there's something pretty positive about that country, and I would like to see Israel reciprocate that and be more open to a diverse array of immigrants.
Mr. Dershowitz, I'd love to jump in and bring us back to the point you made just a minute ago about different perspectives and the controlling of personal relationships, whether you're talking about Israel or Palestine. I'm Nancy Marcus. I'm the constitutional law professor at Indiana Tech Law School.
Oh, great. Nice to talk to you.
It's great to talk to you, too. And, I actually heard you as I was driving through Chicago being interviewed on a different radio station, I believe, last weekend. And I was actually kind of yelling into the radio because I wanted to respond, and now I get to.
Good. Good. What did I say? Oh,
well,
my God.
You were challenging people who are fighting for same-sex marriage rights, saying, why are you giving money to Hamas? Why are you giving money to a terrorist organization that persecutes, lesbians, gays, and bisexuals?
Right.
And I have been working on the same-sex marriage issue really for a couple of decades now. I've been writing about it.
As have I, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that you and I feel very similarly about that issue. And I'm with you on that. I don't think that people who are fighting for personal liberty and the right to marry the person of their choice and for LGBT equal rights in general should be supporting an organization that persecutes and even kills people for their sexual orientation. So you found one person, me. I'm with you on that.
And a lot of supporters of equality for gay, lesbian, and transgender people support Israel. But a lot of the radical leadership does not. And you always wonder why. I have an article in my book, Terror Tunnels, where I challenge Italy's leading philosopher, who is openly gay, openly communist, and he supports Hamas, and he wants to give more money to Hamas. He wants to give them better rockets. And I challenged him to go to Gaza and make that point there, and bring his significant other and try to get a hotel room in Gaza. They'd be killed. They'd be murdered. Right. And how can somebody who is so active on behalf of rights of equality support, not only oppose Israel, but support Hamas, which is the most unequal. The Muslims dominate over any other group, heterosexuals over gays. It's just unthinkable. And a woman named Judith Butler, who was Jewish and one of the leaders of the divestment movement against Israel, has called Hamas, quote, a progressive organization that all progressives should support. I don't know what her definition of progressive is. Right. She probably thought Stalin was a progressive. Right. And, people on the hard left often forget that the hard left is anything but progressive.
Right. So if you separate out the issue of what is Israel's or the current government, Israel's policies as far as defending itself against rocket attacks. If you just look at how they treat their citizens and the right of women and same-sex and lesbians and gays to participate, in the military, and on that level, they're very progressive and libertarian.
Well, no. I think Netanyahu's been very clear with Hamas. If Hamas lays down its weapons, we'll have peace.
Okay.
Well,
and I think Netanyahu's been very clear about
weapons,
that.
There'll be peace, and if Israel laid down its weapons, there'd be genocide. Remember, here's a Trivial Pursuit question. Who was the first woman in the history, modern history at least, ever to be elected head of a state who didn't have a husband, a father, a brother, who was also like the head of state? So it doesn't count Indira Gandhi, it doesn't count many of the... Who was the first woman ever in history, modern history?
Golda.
And it was Golda Meir. And that was way back when women, were not being elected. It was before Hillary Clinton and before Margaret Thatcher and before, the current.
But Mr. Dershowitz, your life is entirely different when you lead it at the point of somebody else's rifle. I mean, it's an entirely different existence. Can I ask you a very, very difficult question about Iran?
Of course. Yeah.
So what's it going to look like? The United States doesn't appear to help Israel in disarming the Iranian desires to possess nuclear weapons. And I hate to say, unfortunately, I think that if Iran has the capability of deploying a nuclear weapon, they are going to deploy it.
Well, they've said so. They've said so. Just 2 days ago, the Iranian government said it wanted to destroy Israel again. Look, Israel's not going to let that happen, but
how's it going to go down?
It's going to be a very difficult situation. If the United States makes a bad deal with Iran, which it might very well do.
It might very well.
The fear is that Barack Obama wants to kick the can down the road and say, look, as long as Iran doesn't develop nuclear weapons on my watch, that's okay. So I'm not going to require them to stop spinning centrifuges as long as they can promise me they're not going to develop nuclear weapons on my watch. And they won't develop nuclear weapons on his watch, but they'll be ready to do it. Israel will not accept that deal. And then after the United States makes a deal with Iran, Israel will have to attack the Iranian nuclear reactor the way it did the Osirak nuclear reactor in Iraq back in 1981.
No, but it's not going to be a single strike, sir. It's going to be...
I know, of course not. And, of course, some of the facilities are hidden under hospitals, under mosques, so there will be civilian casualties. I don't know what happened 2 weeks ago or last week when an Iranian nuclear trigger factory was blown up. I don't know whether that was the United States, whether it was Israel, whether it was the MEK opposition in Iran. I sure hope it was not just an accident. I hope that there were efforts from external sources to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons, because a nuclear weaponized Iran is the greatest threat of the 21st century, far more than ISIS, far more than any of the other groups today. You give a major country with a major army and air force the capacity to send nuclear rockets not only to Israel but to southern Europe and to give bombs, dirty bombs, to its allies, Hezbollah and others, and it's a game changer, to use President Obama's own terms. So I hope President Obama will not accept a bad deal, but if he does, we may see a repeat of what happened in 81. In 81, Israel attacked Iraq's nuclear reactor, and the United States, Ronald Reagan, condemned it and voted to sanction it in the Security Council. Then 10 years later, they thanked Israel for doing it, because if Iraq had nuclear weapons, they'd still be in Kuwait, and Saddam Hussein would still be in charge. So the United States was very thankful for what Israel did, but it condemned it. That could happen again, but I think the United States, particularly this administration, would be furious at Israel if it tried to destroy Iran's nuclear reactor after the United States made a deal that the United States thought was a good deal, but Israel decided it was not a good deal. So it could create real tensions between the United States and Israel.
Mr. Dershowitz, wanted to get your take on a leading political figure in Israel. He passed away last year. It's estimated about 800,000 people went to the funeral for Ovadia Yosef. He was the founder of the Shas Party, and he's made some comments.
I have nothing good to say about him. I can tell you that right now. I have nothing good to say about him. Some of the things he said have been so racist, outrageous, and he has a lot of followers. I agree with you.
But how can he play such a critical, vital part? The Shas Party is since 1984 has almost always been with the party in power. They're called the undisputed kingmaker of Israeli politics. And
although the head of the party went to jail, of course, for a number of years, Derry. When you mix church and state, it's bad for both church and for state. And I would like to see a government in Israel that said no, we're not going to allow Shas or any of the ultra-religious parties into the coalition. Unfortunately, the Israeli legal system is such, political system is such that you need to create these coalitions, and the idea that anybody like this man should have anything to do with government, for me, is appalling. But when you compare that to the Palestinian Authority, which every Friday has these anti-Semitic sermons on Palestinian Authority television, official Palestinian Authority television. If you don't believe me, just go online and read MEMRY, MEMRYI.org, and you can just watch these speeches. They're translated into English. They're outrageous. The difference is that Yosef did not speak for the Israeli government or for Israelis. He was just a rabbi with a lot of influence. But remember, 800,000 people came to his funeral. That means 7 million others didn't, and probably 4 million of them would have danced on his grave. They hated him with such passion for the very kinds of things he says and the kinds of things he's done, and how he denies Israelis liberty, freedom of marriage, freedom of religious dissent, and that kind of thing.
But he also did serve 10 years as the Sephardic chief rabbi, and so he was elected, and he held
elected by Sephardic Jews of a certain dimension. Yeah, I agree with that. But you can find in any country. Look at what some. There is a cardinal in Honduras who blamed the Jews for the sex scandal among some Catholic priests. So you find people in every religion who make outrageous statements. Bishop Tutu, who was an overt anti-Semite, and who was the head of the South African Episcopal Church, and he's talked about Jews this and Jews that, and he sounds sometimes like he could be writing in the 14th century. So you find that in every religion. You find it among atheists and agnostics. You just can't judge a country by what some of its ministers, imams, preachers, rabbis, and others say.
But how is it that the Israeli government would choose to form a coalition with?
Because it had no other choice. I mean, believe me, every government would prefer not to have the ultra-religious. Remember, Israel is a secular country. Benjamin Netanyahu is a very secular person. He was criticized recently for having dinner with me at a fish restaurant in New Jersey, which served shrimp and lobster.
Right.
And Bibi, who's a friend of mine, is a secular person. Out of respect for the traditional, he doesn't eat unkosher food, but he doesn't live a religious life. And none of the leaders, not a single leader in Israel's history, has ever been an Orthodox Jew. Herzl was an atheist. Ben Gurion was an atheist. So you have a country that's based on Jewish heritage, but not Jewish religion. But when you have a country with perhaps 1 million Orthodox Jews living in it, you're going to have some influence that those people have, particularly in a coalition-type government.
That's the nature of a coalition government.
It's a tragedy, yeah.
And Professor, my grandpa always told me that once you find the perfect church, don't join it because you're going to make it imperfect.
That's a good argument.
And,
right?
and you've been very clear that Israel has problems just like the United States of America has had problems, and there's always times for us to complain because our government is not perfect. Recently, this past week, you lit up Jimmy Carter, former President Jimmy Carter, on his stance of ISIS being hypocritical to his stance on Hamas.
Right. He's suddenly become a hawk on ISIS when, he was a chicken hawk when it came to Iran. He enabled the Khomeini government to come into power. He said positive things about Khomeini and negative things about the Shah. We all wish we had the Shah back now, notwithstanding how repressive he was. Certainly a lot safer and a lot better for America than the subsequent regime with Khomeini. And I just don't, Jimmy Carter is such a hypocrite. He was a failed president, and now all he does is criticize other presidents, both Republicans and Democrats. He interferes with American foreign policy. He told Yasser Arafat not to accept the 2000-2001 peace offer from Bill Clinton and Ehud Barak, and therefore he has blood on his hands. 4,000 people died as a result of the Intifada started after Jimmy Carter told Arafat not to accept the peace deal, and Arafat didn't accept the peace deal. And, he's become a full-throated fan of Hamas. He thinks Hamas is a legitimate political organization, he and Bishop Tutu, and that it should be recognized, negotiated with, treated like any other political group. Why not ISIS?
ISIS
is a lot more powerful today than Hamas.
Well, Professor, you go even further than that. You accuse Mr. President Carter of actually getting money from Hamas, don't you? I mean,
no, he's gotten money from Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia,
Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and some of the other Emirates, which have been, in the past at least, pro-Hamas. Of course, now Turkey has become pro-Hamas. Qatar is pro-Hamas. And when the Carter Center start getting money from Saudi Arabia, suddenly they no longer were investigating human rights violations in Saudi Arabia. So follow the money, and you can predict where Jimmy Carter is going to come out. There are two ways of knowing how Jimmy Carter is going to come out. Follow the money and know what side Israel's on. He'll be on the other side.
Well, ISIS is the first terrorist organization Jimmy Carter hasn't liked. So I gotta wonder why. Why is ISIS the bad guy to Carter?
Oh no, ISIS is the bad guy because they're opposed to the Emirate states that give him all the money.
Okay.
So that's a follow the money kind of thing. Saudi Arabia doesn't like ISIS, so Jimmy Carter doesn't like ISIS. Saudi Arabia does like Hamas, so Jimmy Carter likes Hamas. I mean, you can know where Jimmy Carter's coming out. As I said, two criteria: follow the money and see where Israel is. He'll be on the other side. Often see where the current American president is, and he'll be on the other side.
Right.
Too.
That concerns me even more.
And Mr. Dershowitz, I'm so glad to get your input on Israel, because I knew you would give excellent answers in regards to those issues that have created controversy. So what is the answer? We have the West Bank, we have Gaza.
Israel should make peace with the Palestinian Authority, should make them a very generous offer, should end settlement activities on the West Bank, should have land swaps whereby it can keep some of the areas that are within the security boundary, and make peace with the Palestinians on the West Bank, and keep fighting terrorism against Hamas.
Should that quote "making peace" should that contain a completely sovereign, independent, free nation?
Yep.
Yes.
Why?
I'm in favor of a Palestinian state. I think it would be good for peace in the region. I think it would be good for Palestinians who really want to thrive and live in peace with Israel. I think it would be good for Israel. Israel won't have to be monitoring, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians on the West Bank. I think it should keep its security barrier up, and that saved lots and lots of lives. It should perfect the Iron Dome, and it should maintain some troop presence along the Jordan Valley to prevent ISIS from coming in through the Jordan Valley. And I think, by the way, a Palestinian state would want Israeli troops to protect it from ISIS, because the Palestinian Authority, doesn't have an army capable of defending itself against ISIS. So I think there are routes to peace. I don't think there are right now in Gaza. I think, as Rabin once said, fight terrorism as if there's no peace process, and make peace as if there's no terrorism. So I think both are consistent, and Israel can do more to make generous peace offers to the Palestinian Authority, to Abbas, and continue to fight against Hamas with both barrels open, understanding that inevitably there'll be some civilian deaths because Hamas uses human shields. In my book, Terror Tunnels, I call it the dead baby strategy. They put young children and women in harm's way deliberately to induce Israel to a terrible choice. Either don't fight back and let your own civilians die, or fight back and you will inevitably kill some civilians. The United States is facing the same choice now in Syria and in Iraq with ISIS, and civilians are dying, and there'll be more civilian deaths as ISIS learns from Hamas how to use people they've captured or people whose cities they've gone into as human shields, and they're going to do it.
The Israeli Supreme Court had required the release of a government study with regards to calorie consumption in Gaza. Turns out that the amount was 2,279 was the required amount, and so what had happened was that the number of trucks being delivered into the Gaza on a daily basis went from about 400 to 106. These things, from a public relations standpoint, do cost Israel across the country, or across the world. So I completely agree with you that there should be a sovereign, free, independent country. How soon can that happen so that Israel doesn't have to have these public relations problems coming out?
Rick, hold on. So this is one of those times. Mr. Dershowitz, I completely disagree. I've got to ask you, why do you think there should be a second state? Why shouldn't Israel just finish this thing and actually win this war? They didn't declare it. Why shouldn't they just do it?
It wins the war by making peace with the Palestinian people on the
Make
West
peace
Bank.
with the bulldozers.
Israel doesn't want to control a million or more Palestinians. It wants to have control over its own citizens. And it never would have occupied the West Bank if Jordan hadn't attacked it. That was not part of its war plan in 1967. In fact, it sent emissaries over to Jordan and said, please, don't attack us, and we will not take an inch of your land. It was only after they were attacked that they attacked back and got the West Bank and the Gaza. But, Israel has secure boundaries. It has to expand them a little bit in certain areas, and that was understood by Resolution 242 of the UN. But I think the two-state solution is good for Israel. The vast majority of Israelis want it, and they're the ones who get to vote. And it would pass a referendum as long as there were secure boundaries. And I think Israel doesn't want to control the lives and destinies of Palestinians. Look, Ramallah is a terrific city. It looks like downtown Jerusalem. It has high tech. It has Mercedes and BMWs running through the streets. It's doing very well. The West Bank has a very good GNP, increasing. Gaza, not so much. But by the way, there's no poverty or real hunger in Gaza. You go to Gaza. I've been in Gaza many times. You see thriving markets, high rise. But most of that's controlled by Hamas. It's a kleptocracy. They steal the money that's given to them by the Europeans, and they don't give it to the citizens. So the citizens of Gaza have a gripe, but it's not a gripe against Israel. It's a gripe
But how do you
against
make
their own
peace with
leaders.
people who don't want to make peace?
Well, you don't make peace with the people who don't want to make peace. You make peace with the people who do want to make peace. And Abbas, if you give him the right terms, will want to make peace. Obviously, Israel will have to compromise. The Palestinians will have to compromise. But that's in the nature of how you make peace.
Mr. Dershowitz, according to the Associated Press, in 2011, the per capita income was estimated to be about $31,000 in Israel, but for those people in the occupied territories, it was estimated about $1,500, and since then...
And in Jordan, it's lower, and in Egypt, it's lower, and so even people who are under occupation by Israel have better health care, higher GNP, longer longevity, better judicial system, more safety than any Arabs who live in the areas that are governed themselves. Now, I'm not talking about the Saudi princes. Their life is better. But the people who work for the Saudi princes or the Qatari princes, their life is miserable. In fact, when a bunch of people got out of Gaza a few years ago and escaped into Al Arish, part of Egypt, they immediately came back because they saw that life was better in Gaza, not as good as it could be or as good as they'd like it, but better in Gaza than in those parts of Egypt. So you have to look at it comparatively, and of course you're going to find any country under occupation, whether it was Germany under the occupation after the Second World War, Japan, any country like that is not going to have the same rights and the same GNP as the population that's occupying it. But remember, Israel offered to end the occupation in 2000, 2001, 2008. The Palestinians did not accept that. So the blame for the continuing occupation is largely on Palestinian leadership, not on Israel. It's made the offer twice, at least twice, to end the occupation. And they ended the occupation in Gaza, and look what happened. Rockets, tunnels, it didn't create an independent
It didn't create peace at all.
I
I just don't know that the two-state solution is actually a solution until Israel wins the war.
Well, it's won every war on the ground. The question is, it loses the war of public relations because people, the media, eat up this dead baby.
But it hasn't won the
strategy.
war on the ground. They have not done. Win the war with bulldozers.
Well, it's very hard to do because there are civilians where you would send the bulldozers, and you just don't want to kill civilians. Israel.
No, I don't want to kill anybody.
I
believe peace is patriotic.
The ratio of civilians to combatants is much better than NATO's or most Western countries. So, it's very hard. There are no simple solutions like just winning the war. There's a lot of criticism within Israel that it didn't do enough to destroy Hamas. It didn't do enough to destroy Hezbollah. You have to strike a balance, and Israel's a democracy, and the people of Israel get to decide those issues. You don't, and I don't. And
that's true.
We can have our opinions, but they're going to make the decisions.
Is it fair to say that the reason why it's so difficult is if Israel were to not have a two-state solution, then their only choice is to fold all of those people into a greater Israel, which would create a demographic issue as far as having a democratic and a Jewish state, or keeping them under perpetual eternal occupation, which, as you said, from a public relations standpoint, every year that the occupation continues, it continues to create negative publicity.
Yeah, interestingly enough, it doesn't create negative publicity when China does that to Tibet, which has been more than 50 years, and with no rights that the Tibetans have, or when Russia occupies part of Ukraine and Chechnya. It's only Israel that gets the negative public relations, and I've told my friends in Israel, never do anything for public relations purposes, because you're never going to win the public relations war. Do it because it's right. And I think it's right for Israel to try to make peace with the Palestinians on the West Bank and continue to have a military response to Hamas in the Gaza. And I don't see that as inconsistent. And one would hope that if the Palestinians have a state on the West Bank and they thrive, the people of Gaza would say, like the people of East Germany said when they saw West Germany, gee, maybe we should knock the wall down. Maybe we should really become part of the thriving Palestinian state on the West Bank rather than live under the kleptocracy of the terrorist organization Hamas. The vote doesn't seem to suggest that. Hamas increased its popularity in this war, even though 2,200 people were killed in the process. And so, it's very, very complex. And Israel has to make sure that it maintains its capacity to defend itself against all of the enemies in the surrounding areas, including Iran, because Iran is the only country that today poses a real existential threat to Israel.
Professor, I want to be conscientious with your time, and thank you so much for spending it with us. You're so knowledgeable about all these issues. We really enjoy talking to you.
Well, I hope you guys can help clean up Indiana. I have to tell you that.
We're trying, sir.
Indiana judicial system. And, it's such a wonderful state. It has had such wonderful senators and congressmen over the years. Some of the best lawyers I've ever worked with, people like Lee McTernan and others are there. They're just terrific lawyers and terrific human beings. I just wish the judiciary and would be up to the people. It's a disappointment that the people of Indiana deserve a better judiciary than they've gotten over the past years, at least since I've been following it in the Tyson case.
We will work on it for sure, sir. One more question before you go. Arizona, Alaska, and Wyoming legalized same-sex marriage yesterday. The tally of states in the country now is
31,
32.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right.
32 with Wyoming. It's Wyoming.
Okay.
32 with Wyoming.
Great.
Yes, sir. I actually heard a program this past week on Newsmax where you talked about the Houston mayor who is subpoenaing the pastor's sermons. Could you touch that real quick before you go?
I wish he had read Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter about that, actually, where they try to prosecute a preacher for making sermons, I think maybe against the revolution or in favor of Great Britain. And Jefferson basically says you just don't prosecute ministers for expressing religious views. Now, if they incite violence, that's another thing. But I think they've withdrawn the subpoena. They've returned to some sensibility. Look, don't go to the church of a guy who preaches against gay people or against gay marriage. Stay out of his church, but don't subpoena him. He has a right to say what he says, and you have a right not to listen to him.
There you go.
Hey, thank you very much, sir, for being
My
on
pleasure.
the air with us.
Thank you. What good talk. I'd love to come back sometime. You guys are terrific.
Oh, we'd love to have you back.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Good.
Professor Dershowitz has written the book Taking the Stand. You can find all of his publications on alandershowitz.com. You can also find his new ebook, Terror Tunnels, on amazon.com. Thanks again, Professor.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah,
Have a great
day.
afternoon. Have a great weekend.
Truth, justice, and the American way. We are the voices of dissent.